the longest night in history. What arrived at the tomb that Friday afternoon barely resembled a human being. To grasp the full weight of what happened, you have to look directly at the brutality of Roman flogging. The flagrum, an instrument made of braided leather strips embedded with bone fragments and metal, systematically destroyed the flesh of the back, exposing muscle and, in extreme cases, the ribs themselves. Eusebius and other historians of the period document victims whose internal organs were visible before the crucifixion even began. The nails were not driven through the palms as popular imagery suggests, but through the wrists in the space between the forearm bones, the only point capable of bearing the body's weight without tearing through the flesh. After 6 hours hanging on a cross under the April sun in Jerusalem, the right side of Jesus' chest was pierced by a Roman spear. John records a detail of clinical precision. Blood and water came out, what modern medicine identifies as pericardial fluid mixed with blood, evidence that the heart had ruptured. That ravaged body was laid inside the tomb. And here lies the point almost no one stops to seriously consider. Between the moment the entrance was sealed and the moment the women arrived in the early hours of Sunday morning, approximately 36 hours passed. 36 hours of total darkness, inside a chamber carved into the limestone of Jerusalem. Not one of the four Gospels describes what happened in there. The instant a mutilated corpse returned to life occurred without a single human witness, in the dark, in complete silence. The afternoon of death. Around 3 in the afternoon on Friday, Jesus died. The sky over Jerusalem had been dark since noon, 3 hours of darkness in the middle of the day, a phenomenon recorded by all three synoptic Gospels and mentioned even by Thallus, a pagan historian writing around AD 52. Thallus tried to explain it as a solar eclipse, but that is physically impossible during the Jewish Passover, which always falls on a full moon, while solar eclipses only occur on a new moon. In trying to explain it away, he ended up confirming that something extraordinary had taken place. In that atmosphere of silent chaos, the temple veil, a curtain roughly 60 feet tall and as thick as a man's hand, tore from top to bottom. The earth shook. Rocks split apart. And it was at this moment of maximum tension that one man made a decision of enormous personal risk. Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, the very council that had condemned Jesus hours earlier, went in person to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate to request the body of the executed man. Luke takes care to note that Joseph had not agreed with the verdict. But there is a vast difference between quietly disagreeing and publicly identifying yourself as a follower of someone the Roman Empire had just executed for sedition. Mark uses a specific word. He dared to go. That decision could have cost Joseph his position, his fortune, and his life. Pilate's response revealed something significant. He was surprised to hear that Jesus was already dead. Crucifixion was designed to be slow. Victims commonly lingered for 2 or 3 days. That Jesus had died in 6 hours pointed to an extreme degree of physical destruction. Pilate summoned the centurion in charge of the execution to confirm the death before releasing the body. That detail matters enormously. The centurion was a professional who had overseen countless executions. When he certified the death, there was no room for error. The so-called swoon theory, the idea that Jesus had merely fainted and later revived, collapses in the face of a trained military officer's official report. The rushed burial. The sun was going down. Within hours the Sabbath would begin, and no work could be performed until Saturday night. Preparing a body for Jewish burial was a lengthy process. Washing, anointing with spices and oils, wrapping in linen strips. There was no time. Joseph had 2 hours at most. John records the arrival of Nicodemus, another secret member of the Sanhedrin who had visited Jesus quietly at night, months earlier. This time he appeared in broad daylight, carrying approximately 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. For context, the burial of an ordinary Jewish man used a small fraction of that amount. That quantity was reserved for royalty. The same man who had previously only found the courage to seek Jesus under cover of darkness now showed up publicly, carrying spices worthy of a state funeral. The death of Jesus was turning timid men into courageous ones. The tomb was in a garden near the execution site, carved directly into the limestone, brand new and never used. That kind of burial place was rare and expensive. It took months to complete and was an unmistakable sign of significant wealth. Matthew confirms it. The tomb belonged to Joseph himself. With the golden light of late afternoon settling over the garden, 2 wealthy men carried the broken body of a Galilean carpenter into the stone chamber, while the women who had followed Jesus watched from a distance, memorizing every detail of the location. The body was laid on a stone ledge. The linen strips were wrapped around it along with the spice mixture. The resinous myrrh, as it dried, bonded to the fabric and the skin, creating a rigid casing that was virtually impossible to remove without tearing. A separate smaller cloth was placed over the face. The work was done in haste, the ritual left incomplete, and the women planned to return after the Sabbath to finish the preparation. A stone was rolled to seal the entrance. Not just any stone. First-century Jewish tombs used disc-shaped stones, like enormous coins, that ran along an inclined groove and descended by gravity until they locked the opening shut. Archaeologists have identified more than 900 tombs from the Second Temple period in the region, and those with this type of closure used stones weighing between 1 and 2 tons. Opening the tomb meant pushing that mass uphill along the groove. No single person could do it alone. The panic of the opposition. While Jesus' followers retreated into grief and fear, one group of men acted with surprising urgency. On Saturday, breaking their own sacred laws of rest, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. The level of desperation that drove them to violate the Sabbath reveals just how deeply afraid they were. And what they said is even more telling. We remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, "After 3 days I will rise again." The enemies of Jesus took the prophecy seriously. His opponents knew the promise more clearly than his own disciples, who at that moment were hiding in despair with no plan of action whatsoever. The irony is staggering. The people trying to bury the movement believed more strongly in the possibility of the resurrection than those who were supposed to be expecting it. The request was straightforward: post a guard at the tomb until the 3rd day, to prevent the disciples from stealing the body and telling the people he had risen. Pilate authorized it. The exact nature of the guard assigned, whether temple police or a Roman unit, has been debated for centuries, but the implications are enormous either way. A Roman guard consisted of elite soldiers, typically 4 to 16 men rotating in shifts, trained killers operating under penalty of death if they failed their assignment. Falling asleep on duty was punishable by execution. These men understood precisely what was at stake. The Roman seal completed the fortress, a rope stretched across the stone, fixed with wax and stamped with Rome's official signet. Breaking that seal was not a local religious offense. It was a crime against the empire, punishable by crucifixion upside down. The quietest Saturday. Jerusalem was packed during Passover. The historian Flavius Josephus estimates that the city's population swelled from around 80,000 to more than 250,000 during the festivals. Every one of those people knew what had happened on Friday. The man who had entered the city 5 days earlier, hailed as a king, with crowds throwing palm branches on the road and shouting hosannas, now lay in a sealed tomb. The disciples were shattered. Luke captures the devastation in a single sentence, spoken the following day by 2 of them: "We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." Past tense. The hope had died on the cross. Locked in a house with the doors shut out of fear, there was no plan, no conspiracy, only the terror of being next. Peter carried an additional weight. Hours before the crucifixion, he had denied knowing Jesus 3 times. Luke describes the moment the rooster crowed. Jesus turned and looked directly at him. That look followed Peter through the entire Sabbath. Now he was locked away somewhere in Jerusalem, carrying not only grief but the deepest shame he had ever known. Mary Magdalene, who according to Luke had been freed by Jesus from 7 demons, whatever that means in your interpretation, was on the eve of something that would change everything. The only thing she could do was wait for the Sabbath to end so she could go finish preparing his body with the spices that had run out. Nobody in this story was expecting a resurrection. Nobody. The pain had erased the promise from all of their memories. Early Sunday morning. Matthew is the only evangelist to describe what happened at the tomb before the women arrived. A great earthquake, the second in 3 days. An angel descended from heaven, rolled back the stone weighing 1 to 2 tons and sat on top of it. The description of the being is blunt. His appearance was like lightning, his clothing as white as snow. The Roman soldiers, hardened professionals of war, fell to the ground like dead men. They didn't flee, didn't fight back, couldn't even move. Here is something crucial that almost no one notices. The angel did not roll the stone away so Jesus could get out. If the resurrected body could later pass through locked doors, as John explicitly describes, then it didn't need the entrance cleared. The stone was moved so that people could go inside and see with their own eyes that the chamber was empty. Mary Magdalene arrived before dawn, while it was still dark, alone. She didn't wait for company, didn't wait for daylight, didn't weigh the risks of walking through an occupied city at peak political tension. She saw the stone removed and ran back to tell Peter and the other disciple. Her immediate conclusion was not, "He has risen." It was, "Someone took the body." If the gospel writers had been fabricating a resurrection story, the first witness would not arrive reporting a theft. She would arrive announcing a miracle. The fact that Mary interpreted the empty tomb as a crime rather than a miracle is exactly the kind of detail that fiction edits out and real testimony preserves. Peter and John took off running. John arrived first, stopped at the entrance, looked inside and froze. Peter went straight in without hesitating, as always. What both of them saw demanded careful interpretation. The linen strips were still in place, not torn, not scattered, positioned as if the body had simply ceased to be inside them. The burial cloth that had covered his face was folded up, set apart from the other strips, in a separate place. That folded cloth destroys any theft theory. Grave robbers don't stop to fold linens. They act fast, grab what they can and run. A stolen body would have left torn and scattered wrappings. And the intact strips create yet another obstacle for every natural explanation. The 75 pounds of hardened myrrh had formed a solid casing around the body. To remove it, you would have had to cut or tear the linen. The linen was whole. Recognition in the garden. While Peter left in confusion, Mary returned to the tomb and stood outside, weeping. She looked in and saw two angels in white, seated where the body had been. Their question was simple: "Woman, why are you crying?" She, so consumed by grief that she barely registered the supernatural, answered with her only concern: "Because they have taken my Lord, and I don't know where they have put him." When she turned around, she saw Jesus standing there but did not recognize him. This pattern repeats throughout the post-resurrection accounts. The disciples on the road to Emmaus walked with him for hours without identifying him. The resurrected body is physical. It eats, it can be touched, it bears the nail marks, but something about it is not immediately processed by human perception. Jesus asked the same question as the angels. Mary, assuming he was the gardener, made a request that reveals the full measure of love. "If you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." A woman willing Jesus to carry
said
a
one
grown
word,
man's body
her
by
name,
herself,
and everything
Love
changed.
doesn't calculate
She
logistics.
recognized
him by his voice, not by his appearance. John records that she answered in Aramaic, "Rabboni," teacher. He had called her by name and she knew immediately who it was. Weeks earlier in John 10, Jesus had said that he calls his own sheep by name. The first recorded word of the risen Christ was not a theological declaration. It was the name of a grieving woman. Mary reached out and held on to him. Jesus instructed her to go and tell the disciples that he was ascending to the Father. The first official mission of the new era was not given to Peter. It was not given to John. It was given to Mary Magdalene. The testimony nobody would have invented. This detail is historically explosive. In the first century, a woman's testimony held no legal weight in Jewish courts. Flavius Josephus explicitly records that women were barred from serving as legal witnesses. Anyone fabricating a resurrection story to persuade a first-century Jewish audience would have chosen men as the first witnesses, not a woman. Making Mary the first to see the risen Christ was credibility suicide. Unless that's exactly how it happened. Unless the authors were committed to the facts regardless of how those facts would land with their readers. Mary ran back, but this time it wasn't desperation driving her. It was something she could barely contain. She found the disciples and announced, "I have seen the Lord." Their reaction, according to Mark, was flat-out rejection. Luke goes further, recording that her words seemed like nonsense to them, using the Greek term luros, which literally means the raving of a sick person, delirious babbling. These men were not credulous or faith-driven. They heard the first-hand testimony of someone they knew and trusted, and dismissed it as the breakdown of a woman destroyed by grief. Any theory that tries to explain the resurrection as a product of the disciples' belief crashes here. They had no belief to produce anything. #the road to Emmaus. While the disciples argued in Jerusalem, two followers were heading down the road toward Emmaus, a village about 7 miles from the city. One of them was Cleopas. They were doing what people do when hope collapses, leaving, going back to the life they had before. Midway through the walk, a stranger came alongside them and fell into step with them. Luke adds that their eyes were kept from recognizing him. The stranger asked what they were discussing. Cleopas, stunned, answered, "Are you the only visitor in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened there in these days?" The irony was almost absurd. He was asking Jesus whether Jesus knew what had happened to Jesus. What followed was an honest and painful account. Cleopas described a powerful prophet, handed over by the chief priests, condemned and crucified, and then delivered the sentence that carried the full weight of those days. "We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." Past tense. The hope had been buried right along with the body. Cleopas knew it was the third day. He knew the prophetic deadline, and he was still walking away from Jerusalem. The information was in his head, but his heart had already given up. He mentioned the women, the empty tomb, the angels, the disciples who had confirmed nothing was inside. And then his closing line, "But him they did not see." That was the crux of it. The empty tomb was a problem to be explained, not a reason to believe. What would change everything was seeing. Jesus responded by calling them foolish and slow of heart to believe everything the prophets had spoken. And over the course of a 2-hour walk, he led the greatest Bible study ever conducted, connecting Genesis, Exodus, the Psalms, Isaiah, Daniel, and Malachi, showing how every text pointed to exactly what had happened that Friday. When they reached the village, Jesus made as if to continue on. The 2 men held him back. "Stay with us, it's nearly evening, the day is almost over." At the table he took bread, gave thanks, broke it and handed it to them. The gesture. The way he broke the bread. Maybe the marks on his hands. Their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and in the next instant he was gone. The reaction was immediate. Weren't our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road? They had already known. Something inside them had been on fire the entire walk, a certainty the mind hadn't yet caught up to. It was night, they were exhausted after 7 miles on foot, and they got up right then and went running back to Jerusalem. Because what they had witnessed could not wait until morning. The encounter with Peter. When they arrived and found the 11 gathered together, they didn't even get to lead with their story. The disciples spoke first. "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." At some point during that Sunday, before Cleopas returned, Jesus had met with Peter privately. The Gospels don't narrate that encounter. Paul confirms it in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 5, listing Peter as the first of the apostles to see the risen Lord, but no text describes what was actually said. Think about the weight of that moment. Peter, who had denied Jesus 3 times, who had wept bitterly when the rooster crowed, who had spent the entire Sabbath crushed under unbearable guilt, suddenly standing face to face with the man he had betrayed. Alive. Looking at him. The silence of the texts around this moment may be intentional. Some encounters are too sacred to be turned into narrative. What we know is the outcome. By the time Cleopas arrived, Peter was already a changed man. Locked doors. While they were still telling their stories, Jesus appeared in the middle of the room. No footsteps. No door opening. No warning. He was simply there. John confirms the doors were locked. Jesus didn't open them, he passed through solid matter as if it didn't exist. The disciples' reaction was not joy. It was terror. Even in his physical presence, their first response was fear. They thought they were seeing a ghost. No speech, no rebuke. Jesus responded practically, "Look at my hands and my feet, it is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you can see I have." He stretched out his hands, showed them his feet and his side. The marks were there, visible, tangible. He didn't demand blind faith. He offered empirical evidence. Touch me, check for yourselves, use your senses. And when Luke records that they still did not believe, not from doubt but from sheer astonishment, Jesus did something no collective hallucination or mystical vision could ever do. He asked for food. They gave him a piece of broiled fish and he ate it in front of them. A body that passes through walls but chews fish. That appears in locked rooms but has flesh and bones. No human category holds that. It's not a ghost, ghosts don't eat fish. It's not an ordinary body, ordinary bodies don't walk through solid doors. It is something the 1st century had no language for and the 21st century has no classification to contain. Thomas's doubt. There was one man missing from the room, Thomas. The text offers no explanation. When the other disciples found him and said, "We have seen the Lord," his response became one of the most honest moments ever recorded. "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Thomas wasn't being rebellious. He was a man who had witnessed crucifixions, who knew what death did to a body, and who was not willing to rebuild his entire emotional and intellectual framework on the testimony of people who, in his assessment, might be seeing things due to trauma. He was demanding exactly what Jesus had already offered the others: physical, verifiable evidence. 8 days passed. A full week in which every other disciple had seen Jesus and been transformed. Eyes lit up, fear replaced by something Thomas didn't recognize. He was the only one still stuck in Friday while everyone else was already living in Sunday. The doubt must have been agonizing. Then, with the doors locked again, Jesus appeared the same way and turned directly to Thomas. "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side." Jesus knew exactly what Thomas had demanded, word for word, without anyone having told him. And Thomas's response was not a touch. The text does not record that he put his fingers in the holes or reached into the wound. What John records is immediate and absolute. Asterisk, my Lord and my God. Asterisk. The greatest Christological confession in the Gospel of John didn't come from Peter, the leader, or from John, the beloved disciple. It came from the skeptic, the man who demanded empirical proof. In the Jewish monotheism of the first century, calling a human being, my God, was blasphemy punishable by death. Thomas wasn't being emotional. He was being precise. He looked at the pierced hands and arrived at the only conclusion the evidence could support, even if that conclusion demolished every theological category he had been raised in. Jesus then said something that crossed that room and has reached us 2,000 years later. Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. It wasn't a rebuke to Thomas, it was a bridge to every generation that would come after, who would not have the option of placing their fingers in the nail marks and would need to examine the evidence from a distance. Jesus called them blessed, not inferior. Faith without direct sight was not a lesser version of the experience. In his own words, it was a privileged position. Breakfast on the beach. John closes his gospel admitting he edited, selected, that there was far more material than a scroll could hold. But there was one encounter that still needed to happen. Not in Jerusalem, not in a locked room, but on the shore of a lake that Peter knew better than anywhere else in the world. 7 disciples were gathered at the Sea of Galilee when Peter said simply, I'm going fishing. It was a return to the only thing he knew how to do before all of this started. He had seen the risen Lord, received the greeting of peace, but was still carrying something the appearance in the locked room hadn't resolved. 3 denials and the weight of an unpaid debt. They fished all night and caught nothing. Professional fishermen on the lake they had worked since childhood. During prime fishing hours, 0 results. At dawn, a figure appeared on the shore. They didn't recognize him. From the beach, a voice called out, Friends, haven't you any fish? They said no. Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. They threw it and the net filled so fast they couldn't haul it in. John gives the exact number. 153 large fish. Not many. Not countless. 153. Someone counted. Someone sat on that beach that morning and counted every single fish, one by one, and decades later still remembered the number. That is the kind of detail you don't invent. That belongs to someone who was there and never forgot. It was John who understood first. It is the Lord. Peter, incapable of waiting, wrapped his outer garment around himself and jumped into the water. He swam to shore while the others brought in the boat. When they got there, they found a charcoal fire burning with fish and bread already on it. Jesus had made breakfast. The detail of the charcoal fire was not accidental. The Greek word John uses, anthrakia, appears only twice in the entire New Testament. Here on the beach and in the courtyard of the high priest on the night Peter warmed himself by a fire while denying he knew Jesus. Same setting. Same smell of burning coal. Jesus had deliberately reconstructed the scene of Peter's failure, not to humiliate him but to redo it. After breakfast, Jesus turned to Peter, Simon son of John, do you love me more than these? Peter answered, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, Feed my lambs. A second time, Simon, do you love me? You know that I love you. Take care of my sheep. A third time, do you love me? And Peter was hurt that Jesus asked him a third time. 3 questions. 3 answers. 1 for each denial. Jesus never mentioned the betrayal, never demanded an explanation, never required a public apology. He simply gave Peter 3 chances to say out loud, around the same charcoal fire, in front of witnesses, what his heart actually held. Every, I love you erased 1, I don't know him. Every commission, feed, tend, feed, restored something guilt had worn down. It was the most precise restoration ever performed on a human soul. 40 days and what came after. The appearances continued for 40 days. Acts 1 verse 3 records that Jesus presented himself alive with many convincing proofs, appearing repeatedly in different locations, to different groups, under different circumstances. This was not a single appearance that could be dismissed as a hallucination. Paul, writing around AD 55, just 25 years after the events, lists the appearances in sequence. To Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 people at one time, most of whom, he adds, are still living. That was a verifiable claim made to an audience that could verify it. Paul was saying, if you don't believe me, go ask them. Hundreds are still alive. Nobody makes that kind of statement if they're making it up. On the 40th day, gathered on the Mount of Olives, the disciples were still asking about the restoration of Israel's political kingdom. Jesus' answer reoriented everything. They would receive power when the Holy Spirit came, and they would be his witnesses to the ends of the earth. Not a local kingdom. Not a revolution against Rome. Something that would reach every corner of the inhabited world. And then he rose. They watched, not metaphorically, not spiritually, physically. They stood there staring at the sky until two men in white said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus, who has been taken from you into heaven, will come back in the same way you have seen him go." What has no easy explanation. What happened next is historically undeniable, regardless of what anyone believes about the resurrection. Those men, fishermen and tax collectors from Galilee, walked off that mountain and within a few decades turned the Roman Empire upside down. Peter, the man who denied Jesus in front of a servant girl, stood openly before the Sanhedrin and declared, "We cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard." James, the brother of Jesus, who during Jesus' public ministry did not believe in him, as John 7 verse 5 explicitly records, became the leader of the church in Jerusalem and died as a martyr around AD 62, according to Josephus himself. What turns a man's skeptical brother into a movement leader willing to die for him? Paul, who had been hunting down Christians with official Sanhedrin authorization, completely reversed course and spent the rest of his life being beaten, shipwrecked, imprisoned, and eventually executed, all for a message he insisted he had received directly from the risen Jesus. The alternative theories have existed for 2,000 years. Maybe they stole the body, but Matthew 28 records that the Jewish leaders themselves bribed the guards to spread exactly that version, which means it was known propaganda, not an explanation uncovered later. And it still doesn't explain why the disciples died defending something they would have known was a lie. People die for what they believe is true. Nobody dies for a hoax they personally fabricated. Maybe they hallucinated, but modern psychiatry does not recognize shared hallucinations experienced by 500 people simultaneously, with the same content in the same place at the same time. Maybe they invented everything, but legend makers don't place women as the first witnesses in a world that dismissed female testimony, don't portray themselves as cowards and slow to understand, and don't write 153 fish, when a massive catch would have been far more impressive. And there is one argument that is quiet but persistent. Sunday. Jews had kept the Sabbath for more than 1,000 years when Jesus died. It was the most visible marker of Jewish identity, the fourth of the 10 Commandments. Within a few decades, the followers of Jesus, all of them Jews, stopped gathering on the Sabbath and began meeting on the first day of the week, the day the tomb had been found empty. Acts 20 verse 7 records the community gathering on the first day of the week. The book of Revelation calls it the Lord's Day. What would have the power to make devout Jews abandon a millennial pillar of their faith? What could be so overwhelming that it led them to look at an ancient commandment and say, "Something bigger has happened"? The question that remains. The resurrection is not merely a religious doctrine, it is a historical claim. It is anchored in time and place. Jerusalem around AD 33, during Passover under the governorship of Pontius Pilate, with names, locations and witnesses that could be challenged. It does not ask you to turn off your reason. It asks you to use it, to examine the evidence, weigh the alternatives, observe the transformation of the disciples, the explosive birth of the church, the shift in the day of worship, the martyrs who died without recanting, and reach your own conclusion. Thomas demanded proof. Jesus didn't rebuke him for it. He held out his hands, showed him the wound and said, "Touch me, check for yourself." And then he added that blessed would be those who, without touching, examined the evidence and believed. That Sunday morning the sun rose over Jerusalem like any other day. The same stones, the same olive trees, the same smell of bread from the ovens in the lower city. But a stone had been moved. A tomb was empty. A body that should have been decomposing was standing in a garden, calling a woman by her name. Nothing was ever the same after that. Not for Mary, who ran with news no one believed. Not for Peter, who went from coward to cornerstone. Not for Thomas, who went from skeptic to the highest confession. Not for Paul, who traded persecutor for persecuted. And not for the world, which 2,000 years later still debates, still investigates, still divides over the same words that echoed that Sunday morning, when women came back from a garden and said to men hiding behind locked doors the most unlikely, most absurd and most consequential sentence ever spoken by human lips. He is not here. He has risen.